So welcome everyone. First off, happy Earth Day to all of you. We've got folks represented here from all points of this country, East Coast, West Coast, and I'm sure the attendees also reflect that. I am Gigi Escalante, president of the St. John's College Alumni Association, and the college and the association has worked to produce this Earth Day alumni panel as part of the college's Earth Day events in Santa Fe. The association has been doing these panels for quite some time, since about 2018. And the reason for the panels is multifold. One of the things that we like to do is feature our wonderful alumni and the really great things that they do. Johnnies, because of their education, pretty much can tackle anything. And I think it's important to show the diversity of careers that Johnnies go into as inspiration for our students, right? As an attorney, sometimes I reflect about my career choice and wondering about all the diversity of different careers Johnnies could go into. Not saying I wasn't happy to be a litigator, but I think it's important to show everything that we can do with the Johnny degree that we have and the education, the unique education we were afforded. In addition to that, I think it's good inspiration for prospective students to see a little bit of what happens post St. John's for alumni. And hopefully it provides us an opportunity to do deep dives on issues that are really important to all of us as a community. I think one characteristic of Johnnies is that we love to learn. And so these are really opportunities for us to have a conversation, just like we did at St. John's, but around a specific topical issue. And today it's going to be environment and sustainability. So with that, I also want to do a little housekeeping and let you know that this is being recorded for the reasons that I mentioned, because it is a good resource. And I'd like to welcome you all to this panel. And I'm very glad that the alumni here are contributing this time to this important event. First off, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jane McManus, class of 1993, Annapolis. I know Jane well. We've played on the basketball court together multiple times at Temple Eaglehart, and I'm really pleased that she's agreed to be moderator of this panel. I've been a fan of her work for quite some time. Jane is now the executive director of the Center for Social Media at Seton Hall University. She's had nearly a decade of experience working as a reporter for ESPN, where she was also a columnist for ESPNW. As a veteran journalist, she's her analysis of sports issues has been featured in a plethora of media outlets, including CNN, Good Morning America, Al Jazeera, you name it. And so it's really a privilege to have her here moderating this panel. Jane also has an MS in journalism from Club University, where she taught for over a decade. Thank you, Jane.
Gigi, thank you so much for that introduction and for your leadership on getting this together today. This is where I get to be a bit of a neophyte with this incredible group of professionals that we have here that you've assembled. And I am so excited to introduce them to all of you. And they are going to fill out their background a little bit more as we begin this conversation. But I would love to start with Sarah Beltz-Bodor, who graduated in '94 and who I remember well, who is the Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations for North American Association for Environmental Education. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. We also have Suzanne Bradford, 89, Associate Attorney at Greenfire Law, which is an environmental law firm in Berkeley, California. Thanks for joining us. Suzanne, next up, next to her, Emily Brock, 1994, who is a principal consultant and senior manager of sustainability and climate change at an environmental resource management firm called ERM. And then we have Melanie Santiago Mosier, graduated class of 2000, who is an equitable energy transition advisor at the Nature Conservancy. Welcome, Melanie. And last but not least, Sarah Schrodinger, class of 92, rower, senior educational program manager at the Office of Education for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I would just like to say what an impressive group and what impressive things that you've all done in your careers, and what a great example of what we can do with our St. John's education as well, and the places that it can lead us. I would love it if we could start in the order that you all were introduced. And if you could just give our students and fellow Johnnies an idea of how you got, from graduating either in a Santa Fe or Annapolis to kind of where you are now, and what that looked like. So Sarah Belts, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Jane. It's exciting to be here with everyone. I have a little bit of, I guess, maybe an unusual trajectory in that I took a part-time job at a store in downtown Annapolis as a student my freshman year. And this store was associated with a regional conservation organization called the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And that was back in the days of mail order catalogs. And I essentially shipped t-shirts and maps of the Chesapeake Bay and Save the Bay tote bags and things like that for this organization. I wound up keeping that job all 4 years as a student and stayed in touch with the very lovely people that I had the opportunity to work with in that part-time job. And about 2 years after I graduated, I was kind of in a little bit of a transition, figuring out what I wanted to do next, and reached out to a former coworker in that job and just asked out of the blue, hey, are there any jobs at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that might be of interest? And lo and behold, they were hiring a curriculum writer for Pennsylvania middle schools. And I'm from Pennsylvania, so it felt like a good potential fit. Applied for the job, got the job, and was just really, really fortunate to have mentors and supervisors at that organization who were really willing to take a chance on me and put me in positions and situations that I really had no business being in. And they really pushed me to take leadership roles. So I had the opportunity to write curriculum, develop a student leadership program, create a teacher professional development program. I worked as a fundraiser for that organization. I worked in communications and wrote for them. And then towards the end of my lengthy time there, I got very involved in policy to try to create more systemic support for environmental and outdoor education at both the state and the federal level. And so I realized at that point that I loved policy and advocacy. And I had an opportunity to take a DC-based job with my organization about 7 years ago. And so I did not formally train in policy and advocacy. I was just fortunate enough to be able to sort of learn in real time.
Thanks so much. That's really interesting and a great way to start us off. How about Suzanne, you take us into the world of the law?
Yeah, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this event and so proud of the college for going solar. My journey is also a very circuitous one. It starts here in Santa Fe. I spent all my 4 years as a Johnny in Santa Fe, partly because coming from Chicago, I fell in love with the mountains here. And our experience here, nature is so present on this campus. I think that is part of what inspired me. But when I was a senior here, is the same year that the Yellowstone fires happened and the Exxon Valdez crashed into Prince William Sound. So I studied a lot of ethics, and I felt like, we should look into this. And as Johnnies, we have a skill set. Maybe I can help learn out about the threats to nature and what's going on in a world where these sorts of things are happening. So I went into an environmental studies program up at University of Montana. And when I was there, I just learned so much. I met, regional places have their own unique environmental history. So I got to connect with a lot of wildlife biologists and people working with managing the amazing wildlife of the Northwest. My lights went out.
Speaking of solar power.
Maybe they're testing. So in Montana, my graduate work focused on collaboration and collaborative planning to do problem solving in the environmental sector, especially with a focus on shared scarce resources like water, and now we're looking at climate along similar lines. So it's super interesting to me. And my focus was really on, how do we connect with science and democratic problem solving? Because it's so important for people to have a voice. And that led me back into education. I spent 10 years teaching at University of Montana, kind of with an empowerment motive to teach, critical thinking and the skills of democratic problem solving. But I think the worsening or the growing concern with our climate instability and sustainability challenges really led me back to advocacy and wanting to bump up my advocacy as a lawyer. So I've now been a lawyer for a few years. I'm relatively new to the field. And it's the next step in how do we promote democratic problem solving in my journey. So thank you.
I also love that, that you represent that education is an ongoing process. I think it's, important to realize, especially for today's young students who are coming out, you may have a career and then another career and then another career. We can always kind of learn more as we go along and reinvent ourselves or go further in a different direction. And with that, Emily.
Thanks. Yeah. So after I graduated from St. John's, I thought I wanted to be an environmental scientist, and started out in a PhD program in ecology at University of Oregon. Essentially, as soon as I started it, I realized that what I was really interested in was how science informs corporate decision-making, and how just kind of like the interplay between scientists, the environment, regulators, and corporations. At University of Oregon, of course, the lumber industry out there is still really big. And this was in the mid 90s, quite a contentious time during the Clinton years, as a lot of sawmills were closing down. So I actually dropped out of that doctoral program with the master's. And shortly after, I went back into a doctoral program at Princeton, which was essentially in science studies, technically history of science. It was like housed inside of the history department, but really interdisciplinary, and really gave the students a chance to just really like do what they wanted in terms of putting together a dissertation that just really made sense, as long as the methodology was like semi-historical. So I was doing, environmental and economic studies, and the heart of my dissertation was on Weyerhaeuser Corporation, which has been at times the largest landowner in the United States, and remains one of the largest lumber companies in the world, and has been so since 1900. Following that, I had a postdoc at Stanford, and really thought I was on an academic track. After a few years teaching college, in a faculty role in sort of environmental studies, I realized that what I was really interested in, again, is how corporations make decisions. What are sort of like the knowledge inputs into corporate decision making, and science, regulation, finance, economics, social pressures. And teaching that, being at the remove of the ivory tower, just really was not exciting me. And I was starting to feel there's like a sense of urgency about the climate, about environmental degradation, and that sitting in college, teaching people and hoping that 10 years later, they're in a job where they might be able to do something about it was just really not lighting my fire. So I had a Fulbright and in the Philippines, at a think tank out there. And while I was in the Philippines, I called up my job back in the US and quit, and spent several years overseas in think tanks in the Philippines and then in Germany. When I came back, as Jane was mentioning, education is a lifelong process. I did a one-year master's degree at Yale in environmental management. And then from there have worked in the private sector ever since. So essentially, in a kind of roles having to do with sustainable finance, regulation, disclosure related to sustainability. And now I'm a principal consultant. So I work with corporations on helping them set goals in sustainability and figure out ways to move towards more sustainable practices. So I guess that's a pretty fast run through.
But thorough. but very thorough. I love that you mentioned, I think there are a couple of things for the students who are listening that can take away. Fulbrights are a great way to get some credentials, explore some ideas, try to find things out. That's something that anybody can do once they graduate or even when you're still in college. So just thinking about that, and there are little things you can take away from everyone that has said so far, and just keep listening for that, I think, is important if these are jobs that you're considering. Okay, Melanie, if we could hear your journey.
Great. Well, my journey has been incredibly windy. And I think it's fair to say I never thought that I would be in this kind of position when I was at St. John's College or before that. So let me step back a little bit. What I do now is informed a little bit by the way I grew up. I grew up in a tiny little town in northern Utah in the mountains. I was one of a small handful of brown people in a very white community that was very, very traditional and very conservative. And I lived in a tin can. I lived in a mobile home that was constructed back in the 70s before mobile home construction had any real standards applied to it. So my home was very, very inefficient. So I remember waking up on really, really cold mornings in the mountains in northern Utah and finding a sheet of ice on the inside of our door. That's how inefficient our home was. And so I know my mom worked 2 and 3 jobs at a time to help be able to pay for our heating and cooling bills in such an inefficient home. And those bills had to have been very, very expensive. At the same time, my dad worked on oil rigs. He was just a manual laborer on oil rigs. And I reflect on that a lot because the oil and gas industry is extremely extractive of the communities in which it's located. Those are largely Black and brown communities. Because of his job, he was away from home for weeks at a time. And when he came back, he was very, very tired. Bone just worked to the bone, and he didn't have a lot of energy to spend with the family. So his job was extractive of our family as well. And yet we relied on his paycheck to be able to pay for our rent and groceries and clothes and all of that. So fast forward to St. John's College. Again, my path has been incredibly windy since then. When I was a senior at St. John's, I had the opportunity to intern in a local government affairs shop. And what a wonderful opportunity for anybody who's interested in policymaking, because in Annapolis, we're 2 blocks from the State House. In Santa Fe, you're also close to the State House. In Albuquerque, not too far away. So it was a wonderful opportunity to really start to really understand the workings of the lawmaking process. And while I was doing that, and then I stayed on and worked for that lobby shop for a couple of years. And as I was there observing different people doing government relations in that advocacy space, it really, what I found was the people that I thought did the best job happened to be lawyers. So I thought, well, shoot, if I want to do this well, I think I need to go be a lawyer. So I went to law school and studied a whole lot of health law in law school. Man, I was the editor-in-chief of the Health Law Journal, taking all kinds of health law classes, doing health law stuff. It was great. Then I went to work for the Maryland General Assembly, the state legislature of Maryland. They didn't have any openings in health-related policy at all. So I got to work on a lot of different issues. I got to work on transportation. I got to work on election law. I got to work on education policy. And then there was a big crisis in Maryland in about 2007 that was going to skyrocket residential electric rates. So I got pulled into that to help out. And I was like, whoa, electricity is cool. This is where it's at. The nerd inside of me just woke up. So that was my entree into energy policy and energy regulation. So I got to work on electricity a little bit while I was still at the General Assembly. And then I got a call from the state public utility regulator. In Maryland, it's called the Public Service Commission. And they were looking for a legislative director. They hadn't ever had one and they needed one. Somebody had recommended me. So I got to go and work for the state utility, energy, and water regulator and did that for several years as the legislative director. And boy, was that a cool experience. I got to be in the back room as the public service commissioners made their decisions, deliberated on what was happening before them. And I really got a lot of experience doing things like writing regulations, observing, again, how processes worked before them. The Public Service Commission is a quasi-judicial body. So it was a wonderful experience to learn how my law degree could actually be used in that way. After a few years, I got a little burned out. We had a lot of different issues that, oh boy, when you're the legislative director and angry constituents are calling their legislators about power outages, and then those legislators call you about power outages, it can take a toll. So I went into private world. So I did government affairs, including policy and regulation for a number of different private energy companies. And the last one that I worked for got really, really big, and it was exciting. And then it got too big, and Wall Street said, "You're too big." And the company said, "We know better. We're going to get bigger." And they went bankrupt because Wall Street said, "No, no, no, you're too big." The cool thing about that last company that I worked for was that they were corporate partners with a nonprofit organization in the US called Grid Alternatives. So that's a nonprofit organization that specifically exists to install solar and train people to install solar for local communities, under-resourced communities, low-income communities. So in my capacity as a corporate partner with that nonprofit, I got to work on policy and regulation with them, and work on policies and work on regulations that would bring the benefits of solar to the families who needed them most, like my family when I was growing up. And so when it came time to jump ship, when my company was going under, I knew I wanted to do that. I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And then the question was, who's going to pay me to do this? Well, I lucked out. I went to work for a nonprofit called Vote Solar, which at the time was starting up a low-income solar access program. And I had the privilege of being chosen to start up that program. Over time, we evolved that program because we figured out that access to energy wasn't going to cut it. We needed to be thinking holistically about equity and justice when it comes to energy. And so I was able to build that program out so that now today, Vote Solar is an organization that is squarely focused on policy and regulation to bring about a just clean energy transition. I got burned out again. Burnout happens, y'all. It's real. And I needed to make another couple of changes. So I've made a couple of changes since then and have ended up at the Nature Conservancy, where I kind of get to do, again, what I did at Vote Solar, and it's really exciting. So what do I do today? My role is Equitable Energy Transition Advisor, and I sit on the Nature Conservancy's Global Renewable Energy team. So the Nature Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit working to create a world where people and nature can thrive. One of our core pillars in our approach to tackling climate change is the acceleration of the equitable renewable energy transition that advances goals for climate, conservation, and communities. So in my day job, I'm helping our teams focus on that third C, that communities piece. Like a lot of big green organizations, the Nature Conservancy is somewhat new to the world of environmental justice, climate justice, and certainly to the world of energy justice. So my role is to help our teams who are working on renewable energy projects and renewable energy policy to apply an equity and a justice lens to how we do that. So really helping my teams think through, how do we really engage with and really elevate the voices of disadvantaged communities, historically excluded communities in the areas where we're work together on solutions that will benefit those communities, and then move forward in a way that benefits those communities. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And that actually brings up something that I'm hearing in a number of your answers as well, is that you had ethical concerns about what was happening with the world and with the way things were evolving, and wanted to be involved in it so that it wasn't something you were watching from afar, but to actually have a hand in how things turn out, which, you know, is really interesting. So Sarah, why don't you round us out here?
Okay. Well, there's a common theme here. I, like my other panelists here, didn't have a direct line to pathway to doing what I'm doing. And frankly, when I was like in my junior year, I finally realized I better start thinking about what the heck I was going to do when I finished St. John's College. And I was fortunate to get connected with Kathy Blitz, who's a tutor on the Annapolis campus. And she was recently arrived tutor, but she had a PhD in marine studies. And I had this vague idea. I wanted to do something related to science. I loved the marine environment, and I wanted to go study marine fish. I mean, honestly, it was like that simple. And she really helped me figure out my pathway to getting into graduate program. And I went at it not planning to get a PhD. I felt like I either wanted to get a master's with a law degree and do something related to policy. So I always knew I wanted to do something related to policy, but I couldn't really articulate what. And I also felt it was really important to understand how science works and understanding sort of like the anthropological side of science before you're trying to apply it to policy. So I ended up at the University of Delaware, and like Sarah Bodor, I had excellent mentors who were willing to take on a very atypical master's student. And I got my master's degree, did research on a marine fish called the tautog, which is actually quite tasty. It's a very popular angler catch in the mid-Atlantic. So if you ever see it, it very rarely shows up in fish stores, but if you like fish, I highly recommend it. But I was there to study the early life history of tautog. And so I did that for my master's degree. And when I finished up, I knew I did not want to go on for a PhD. And I also knew I didn't want to go into law school, that was not my path, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And I was fortunate at that time to get an internship with a relatively new organization in DC, a policy organization called the Consortium for Ocean Research and Education. And it had been established to build support for the ocean research and education work in the United States, primarily through congressional and government affairs. But I came on as an intern and ended up being hired as a contractor. And the long and the short of it is I was there for 9 years. And in the time that I was there, we established an education program. I became much more aware of STEM education policies in the United States and where ocean sciences fit into that, and got to know the ocean sciences community is not really that big a community in the United States. So once you start networking with people, you get to know, you have a lot of nodes of connection that you didn't even realize. And so one of those nodes was at my current employer, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Around about 2002, they had a new administrator. He was doing a top-down, bottom-up review of NOAA's education program, well, all their programs. And one of the things that came out loud and clear was that NOAA needed to have an Office of Education. There had been one a long time ago. It had been shut down, and they needed to reestablish it so that there was some coordination across the agency. So I ended up being hired by NOAA as one of the early employees in that newly reestablished Office of Education. And it's 19 years since I took that job, and our office has grown. And I actually got to know the other Sarah on this panel through that job. I didn't even know her as a Johnny, but we got to know each other through our job. And very early on coming into that office, this is one of those classic things. I was hired to do one thing, which was establish a training program for NOAA's educators, or folks who do NOAA education within our agency in some capacity. And then like Congress gave us a $10 million budget to do ocean education all of a sudden, and we had no program. So it was like one of these classic things. We're like, hey, figure out how to spend this $10 million and do it wisely. And so I and the colleagues that were on staff at the time with our leadership figured out how to establish a grant program. None of us had handled a competitive grant program, and the environmental literacy program is still the longest running environmental education program, grant making program for the federal government. We've continuously issued grants over that whole time. Our focus has changed, and a big part of what I'm here, I think, to talk about on this panel is the more recent focus, which is on building community resilience to climate change. So that's my pathway.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, I'm going to stick then with I just want to say also, we are going to ask for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat We want to be able to ask some of your questions as well as we go along. So keep that in mind. I'm going to start off by asking the other Sarah Belts-Bodor, because you both Sarahs work on educational initiatives. So I'm gonna stick with that for a second and ask Sarah Belts-Bodor, what do you see as the role of education in addressing climate change and other environmental problems, and can policy advance that?
Sure. Well, first, I just will say that, the other Sarah knows this very well. I think that when decision makers are thinking about solutions to complex environmental problems, they very rarely think of education as one of the tools that belongs in the toolbox. So there's a lot of missed opportunity, I think, at every scale to really more thoughtfully and systematically include education. And the reasons for that are so myriad. There are sort of the obvious kind of knowledge and skills development that we need, whether that's in a formal education setting like a school or in a community-based setting, given that many of our solutions to the climate crisis, for example, are going to require adjustments, adaptations, and mitigation at the community level. And we need people with the knowledge and the skills to sort of drive that change. We also need to help build political will among constituents for those kinds of changes. We also need people who know how to engage in the democratic process. So environmental education includes a strong focus on civic engagement and understanding how, as an individual, you participate in decision-making processes. There's also, I think, a really big need for career awareness. We joked as panelists, as in our prep for today, that I know for me, when I was a college student, I thought doctor, lawyer, teacher. Those were the jobs that I knew about. And as this panel proves, there's really a diverse set of career opportunities and pathways. And there's a growing concern right now that with major investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal programs, that there's actually a gap between the green jobs that are being created through those investments right now and the workforce development needs that ensure that we've got people graduating from high school this year and next year and the year after that who, number one, know what those job opportunities are and know sort of what the career and technical education opportunities are. And there is a movement right now, and I know that actually colleagues at NOAA are working on this, on sort of the greening of career and technical education at the middle and high school level to sort of get people ready to sort of fill those jobs. There's also a really big role for school facilities and operations. And I think we often forget that the public school sector represents a huge chunk of our public infrastructure, whether that's the school facilities, the public lands that school buildings sit on, the massive transportation fleet that gets students to and from school every day, and also the food consumption and food waste that is associated with our public school systems. Those are huge opportunities to adapt, to create more resilient school buildings, more sustainable schools, electrify our school bus fleets, and in particular, to do those in the communities that need it most. The state of our public school facilities is frankly, just horrific, particularly in poorer communities with a lower tax base. Our school facilities are in dire need of significant investments that would not only make them better for the planet, but also create a healthier learning environment. We're seeing more and more school closures due to weather-related disasters, extreme heat, extreme cold, because our school buildings are not designed to be able to withstand the changing climate. So there's a school operations piece on that front as well. I could talk about this for quite a while, why we need to have more equitable access to environmental education, outdoor learning. There's just tremendous research about the health benefits to students of being able to spend even short periods of time outdoors. They develop critical thinking and problem solving skills at higher rates when they are able to engage in real world, authentic learning opportunities. And climate anxiety is real. And it is a growing problem among young people and adults. And we know from research that education is one of the ways that we can actually help people develop a sense of agency that lets them believe I can be part of the solution. And there's a lot of research being done that demonstrates that that's a way to address the anxiety, is to actually give people a stronger sense of control, and education is one of the ways to do that. And then I'll just say that the exciting thing is that we are seeing policies that are really driving a more systemic approach to education. There are a lot of state and local school districts that are building education into their climate action plans, that are looking at opportunities to provide funding at the state level for teachers to learn more about climate change and climate change education. They want to teach it, but they don't feel prepared. Survey after survey shows that. But we are seeing a lot of action really rapidly growing at the state and local level on the policy front. And I'll stop there because other people need a turn to talk.
No, that's great though. But you bring up a lot of things. And I mean, I think one of the things that obviously affects education when it comes to this area is it's such a big, and it seems like intractable Gordian knot. Like, who has a solution here that's going to keep this next generation from real suffering, honestly, particularly when we talk about marginalized people who live in low-lying areas. Like, you look at what's happening in New Orleans and you see people are losing their homes because, the water is rising. And like, there are really all of these things that it just seems so beyond one person. I'm going to go to the other Sarah Schodinger over here, because I think you actually are working a lot in the same area. And so I think it might be helpful if you take it from here, because
sure.
Because I think, you've had a front row seat to see how the process of educating people about these issues has changed, what sort of impact it has. Obviously, when you're looking at middle school and high school students, those are the ones who are going to be most impacted by anything that's done, in education and beyond in this issue. So if you could, what are some of the things you see in this space as well?
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting. Sarah did a great job of hitting on so many of the important issues we focus on with regard to building climate resilience and the need for it. As she said, climate anxiety is real. If I look back at our funding program, 8 years ago, up for the 5 years previous, we had really been focused on climate science education. And the problem with that was it was all about learning about the problem. Well, that left people what do you do with that, right? It doesn't give you a pathway to take action, leaves you pretty depressed and anxious. And that's a very real phenomenon. And that's unfortunately, because we're in the thick of it now, and we're going to be dealing with this climate change impacts for a long time. It's something we're going to have to manage for the long term. So when you're talking about dealing with middle and high school students, and frankly, even adults, people who work in this space, people who are, like you said, watching their communities literally sink into the Gulf of Mexico, and talking about having to migrate their entire communities where they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, that is an existential threat, right? And that's a lot to grapple with on top of just your day-to-day existence. So providing the tools through education to allow people to take action that's positive, and take collective action. I think we, for a long time, focused on having people take individual actions, like switch out your light bulbs, whatever, and I'm not against that. But quite frankly, it's really going to take community-wide, regional, and national, global, we have to scale these behavioral changes up. And so it's not enough to just have, a few handful of people making changes in their life. We have to change the whole system in which we're operating. And that takes multiple approaches. When you're talking about dealing with middle and high schoolers, again, giving them a voice, showing them the pathways to actually influence policy change. And this is happening. We've seen this with projects we funded. We have a project up in New York City. The schools, when Hurricane Sandy hit, the schools were either damaged by the storm, or they were the places where people went to shelter from the storm or at the aftermath of the storm. And yet in New York City's climate resilience plan, which is called 1NYC, there was no mention of schools or K-12 education in their plan. Now there is, and there's a whole task force of people, and it's not just the affluent members of the community either. They have, they are working with people from We Act and other well-known environmental justice organizations in the area to ensure that it is an issue that is being addressed at a policy level, and then in actually at the school facility level. And a lot of that came about because of the students who got engaged, as with adult help. I mean, it's not like I don't think it's fair to just say, hey, children are going to deal with this in the future, and we just need to let them take over. And it's those of us who are still here, hey, we have a responsibility to take action as well, while we're helping those on the ground. So that shift from studying the problem to providing support for people to take action, children, youth, and adults, in ways that are developmentally, educationally appropriate, is what our program at NOAA has been focused on in more recent years, and where we've seen a lot of really positive change. Not without its challenges, though.
Not without its challenges. That's the asterisk under the title of this panel, I think, right? Right.
Melanie, I'm going to go to you next, because you have done so much, and obviously even just your story of how you became interested in the whole idea of energy itself has so much of your story revolves around kind of energy justice and that concept. And I think you heard a little bit in what the Sarahs had to say. The education and how that has so much to do with this idea of justice as well, and kind of justice moving forward for different communities who are impacted by this. So if I could turn to you and say kind of what is energy justice, and kind of what is the role of policy in advancing those goals?
Great questions. Thank you so much. So energy justice, I think of as a subset of climate justice, or as a subset of environmental justice. Energy justice, first off, recognizes that the build out of our energy system has had a disproportionately harmful impact on certain communities, namely communities of color and low-income communities. And at the same time, the build out of our energy system has had a disproportionately positive impact on more privileged communities in the United States and globally. And so energy justice is an area that seeks to say, okay, let's figure out where these injustices lie, how they show up, and figure out what we can do as we build out a clean energy future to make sure we're not replicating those same mistakes, and that we're actually applying a justice and equity lens to what we're doing. So first off, how does energy injustice show up? It shows up in a few different ways. So there are the environmental and pollution impacts of the energy system. There's a tremendous amount of data showing that the energy system and other polluting systems far disproportionately impact communities of color and low-income communities. There's the energy bill impact. This is a term called energy burden. Energy burden is the percentage of a household income that goes to pay for their household energy bills. So no surprise, a lower income family is going to spend a higher proportion of their income on their energy bills. But we see systemic racism playing out in this way too. Communities of color also spend a much higher proportion of their household income on their energy bills. Access to clean energy is showing up as an energy justice issue. There's a lot of data coming out about the fact that white wealthy families have a lot of access to clean energy, whereas families of color and low-income families do not have access to clean energy. So there's this access issue to the clean energy revolution. And then there's an economic justice aspect to it as well. Again, the clean energy industry is very heavily populated by white men, which is fine. But think about diversity. diversity is important in moving all things forward, and being successful in all ways. And so there's a lack of diversity when it comes to economic opportunities stemming from the clean energy revolution, be it jobs, workforce development, training opportunities, business development opportunities, and frankly, just wealth building opportunities. So that's what really energy justice is all about. And there's a tremendous role for public policy to help us apply that lens of equity and justice to that, again, the build out of the clean energy system going forward. Energy is one of the most heavily regulated, most heavily legislated industries on the planet. There are graphs that can show this. Crazy amounts of regulation, crazy amounts of legislation involved. And so it really does go to show that there is a huge role for the policymaking to have an impact on a just energy transition. So what does that look like? Well, in practice, the current presidential administration has done a ton to actually advance a clean energy transition that is more just, and a climate going forward that is going to be more just. So one thing that the Biden administration has done was, and on one of the first days of the administration, was issue the Justice 40 initiative. The Justice 40 initiative says that 40% of all government spending on climate and energy initiatives must benefit disadvantaged communities. That's a great starting point. That actually was really interestingly came from a state law that was passed in 2019 in New York called the Climate Leadership and Clean Energy Protection Act, Climate Communities Protection. I'm totally messing up the name. Great law that it was a very comprehensive climate and clean energy law in New York. That law came about because frontline leadership from across the state banded together and worked for years to make that law happen. So I think that that gets to the core of what we need to be considering when it comes to clean energy and climate justice. That doesn't happen because of the grass tops movement. It happens because of the grassroots movement. That's what justice is all about. It's about honoring the voices, honoring the education and expertise of people on the ground, stepping back, giving them the microphone, giving them resources to do the things that they know that they need for their communities.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Melanie. And I'm gonna go to Sue next, because I think actually what you do builds on that a bit, because you deal with people. Then, you're talking about all that can be done for impact, so that certain communities aren't impacted over others, but people are impacted by things that happen in our climate, whether it's, train wrecks that pollute the environment or any other things. And so, Sue, I know you represent people who are often disadvantaged by climate misuse. And what is the role then for litigation and what you're doing? And how can litigation help kind of protect the environment?
Yeah, that's an enormous question, of course, but it does build on the policy work. I think as a background, something that is important to understand is our decision making is dispersed across communities and agencies and so many different decision-making bodies. So when policy is dealing with the big picture, we can have really wonderful policies, and they're thankfully improving and recognizing and building in equity, but there's still a gap between the policy level and what's happening in our local boardrooms and supervisor rooms and city councils. And land use projects are often where the rubber hits the road for communities. The disproportionate impact over the last several decades, if not centuries, of who has borne the brunt of pollution and the short end of the stick when it comes to the benefits. Undoing this is a long process, and it kind of happens one community at a time. So as a litigator, what I've had the great honor of doing in some cases is represent activists and organizations, communities that have organized with the help of these grants and often just in a very grassroots way, to help them then interface with the larger structure and advocate for them, whether it involves going to court. Sometimes litigation is necessary to get people to the table. We have so much inertia in our system, even where you don't have people who intended to harm marginalized people of color. The way the system has evolved, it's built in. So business as usual is doing that. And what some people perceive as normal is often harming some people unintentionally. And you know, without even getting into, you know, the cases of more intentional harm, I think that's relatively rare. But there's a huge amount of inertia, because when we have a legal system that predates environmental understanding, science, ecology was not a thing when these structures. So we've been sort of back-ending these additional laws and policies onto something that is really designed to use resources as much as possible. And now we're saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. And then you get a lot of political backlash as well. So there's different channels for people to advocate for themselves through the public process. But our representatives, our political process, can be very troubling at times, and politicians may or may not, you know, they're balancing which interests to support, of course. So we often end up resorting to litigation to hold public and private entities accountable to the policies that and regulations that have been enacted through statutes, and our executive branch sets policy through the regulations, how to implement these big acts like the National Environmental Policy Act back in 1970 to create the requirement that we will examine the potential environmental impacts before we commit to some new project. That was designed to empower decision makers to make good decisions. Just like liberal arts education is all about making good choices. Litigation is aimed at helping communities know their choices so that they can make good ones. And often we represent the marginalized parties who have been historically shut out of these decisions, and smaller voices to make sure that as we're moving forward, that they do in fact have a seat at the table, that our cultural diversity and our multiple stakeholders, we say that in passing sometimes, but really making sure that's really happening when we make these decisions is kind of our role. And then of course litigation and policy interact. On the one hand, when we litigate, we have to use the existing law such as it is. And it can be frustrating because law can be focused on very narrow points. And we know often that we're going to get a better decision if we go into settlement. And most cases are settled in settlement. But as we're litigating, the limitations of those laws becomes more manifest. And often we bump up against, you know, why we don't have a law that's really speaking to the situation, because we're in a new situation. We've never had this diverse of a society. We've never had these many resource crises between, you know, the impacts on biodiversity of our consumption, the impacts on water of our consumption, and now the climate and population and energy issues are so overarching. But as we encounter these limitations in our legal system, that feeds back to advocating for the policies and legal changes to build into the law these new remedies and this new recognition that we need to make sure somehow that we are addressing environmental justice as we make these decisions. When we build a new development, whether it's for housing or for a new kind of industry or production, the decisions we make today will impact people for 30 to 50 years, maybe longer. And all of the neighbors to that and the impacts on the environment will have consequences. So by trying to exercise foresight, we enforce that through litigation. And hopefully it can be a slow process, which is frustrating. But so I think it's important to emphasize that it's just one piece of the puzzle, that working in concert with the policy and the education and the other creative pathways and private sector solutions too, because private industry making good choices and going green alleviates the need for litigation, right? We all need to, like, you know, it's like one struggle, many fronts. There's so many different niches and opportunities within sustainability advocacy, it's really a rich field, and we have a nice representation here today. But for students looking at how to make a difference, there are just so many choices and opportunities out there right now, ranging from entrepreneurship to litigation and policy and education. But creativity, I think Johnnies are in an exceptional position by virtue of our interdisciplinary background and our ability to articulate and collaborate and work together in problem solving. That's really the puzzle piece that links it all together. And I just want to encourage everyone to think really broadly outside the box as we continue to confront these challenges. It's going to be a haul. But together, you know, there's just so much wonderful work and so many good people throwing in to make this difference. It can be really inspiring too. So thank you.
Yeah, and the law is one way that people with fewer resources can hold entities with greater resources accountable, which, you know, and so much of our, I think, issues around, you know, challenges around this issue have to deal with balancing profits versus communities and the environment and the future. And which leads us to Emily, who's gone into consulting, and this is an important area also because you work with corporations who are looking at growth and are looking to grow and to do things, and they also need to know what the rules of the road are environmentally in the areas where they're trying to expand. And so you're someone who can work with them to understand what those regulations are, et cetera. But I mean, you know, those corporations are not necessarily mission driven, often profit driven. You know, so I would imagine, how do you negotiate that conversation between, you know, environmental protections and regulations and the corporate profit structure?
Yeah, well, I love that you framed it out as conversation, because I mean, to me, so a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a couple of St. John's tutors, and they're kind of going through a little bit of the sort of, you know, the tutor side of St. John's seminars, and how over the course of a year, they kind of plant the seeds for how conversations should happen, and that it's not something people understand right away. It's not like day one of freshman year, everyone knows how to have a really good conversation. It's something that tutors have to guide over the course of the year. And really, on some level, that's a little bit what consulting is also, is that we are a trusted advisor, ideally. In a strategy consulting, management consulting, you're a trusted advisor, and you're in a long conversation with the client about how they can get to how they can get to a solution that works for them. And so it's iterative, right? Like every week you talk to them, you kind of present a little bit more, work through it. It can take a couple of years sometimes for a company really to get enough internal buy-in to make a decision. And I know from the outside, this can be really frustrating to see it and to just be like, they said they're going to do this. Why didn't they do this? Why is this so hard? And the thing is, I mean, corporations are made up of a lot of individual people, just like you and me. And it's really difficult to get everyone moving in the same direction, and to get the leadership structure to agree, even when they think it's a really good idea. Then, you know, leadership in a corporation have to answer to the board of directors. The board of directors represents the shareholders if it's a public company. So it can be a very complex conversation. And it is something that I think St. John's, I mean, to me, I came to St. John's, I didn't come for the books, I came for the conversations. I really enjoyed that process of like a 2-hour negotiation about trying to figure out an answer, try to understand a really complex problem. And that's a lot of what I'm doing now also. So in some ways, the answer to the question of how do companies get to a sustainable future? I mean, first of all, the ground rules are always changing. The targets are always changing. What looked like a really good answer 10 years ago is maybe not also a good answer today. because technology changes, people get a better understanding, companies change, they might divest a business unit. So it's something that it has to be continually revisited. But to get a company to really make a firm commitment and move towards it, it's important to engage all different kind of stakeholders. And I really like that Stu was talking about stakeholders, because if you're talking about like just a standard American corporation, the employees are very important. So they definitely want to make sure that their employees remain very proud of the company that they work for, or they will start to lose employees. They want to make sure that their supply chain partners are happy. So for example, if it's a manufacturing company and they sell to Amazon, Amazon has certain minimum requirements. Believe it or not, they do. So essentially, there's some sustainability commitments that are important for a company, just in order for them to just remain a going concern, to have really smart employees, to maintain business relationships, to keep shareholders happy. Also, of course, is the regulatory frameworks, which Sue also is talking a little bit about. And one thing that's really interesting, since we are, Annapolis is in Maryland, is Maryland just passed one of the most aggressive climate action bills in the country. It's called the Climate Solutions Now Act, and is going to really, as long as nothing really changes, it could really transform the way a lot of companies do business in the state of Maryland. And of course, Maryland is, it's a hugely important state. It's I would say it's not quite as impactful as California regulations, but it is very impactful. And I do work with corporate clients who have had to really rethink essentially how they're going to source electricity for their business operations because of this law. So it is one of these things where it's like, we can kind of dismiss the importance of state politics, but something like this has an effect on businesses that have a global reach. So it's definitely, obviously everyone should keep voting, but it is also, it's something that I think is a little bit behind the scenes. When you see a company making a decision like this, it can be a big outlay of money for them to comply with some of these regulations. So they're not going to be able to get enough internal buy-in for this unless there's like a regulatory need for it. It's not that people don't want to do it. It's just that it's very expensive and they have to, sort of set aside the funds for this. But definitely, I think it's also something really important to consider is that the material sustainability topics for different corporations are very different. And it's really important for a company to sort of look internally, either with the help of sustainability consultants or some other way, and decide sort of what are the most important goals for them to set, things that are doable, and also that are really meaningful for their business activities, and that can actually really make an impact on the planet. So I think it is, a lot of it is, there is some external pressure that company leadership has to deal with, has to negotiate, thread the needle between what shareholders want and what other stakeholders want. But it can be done. And I think that we are kind of moving in a good direction, even in the US. So I can leave it at that. I think that it's something that it's so evolutionary. It's not something that you can really put your finger on, like one type of solution for this, and definitely changes depending on the industry sector, for example. So, in some cases, the answer might just be to divest, get out of a particular kind of business, to just eliminate a part of their company, and like wind down one aspect of what they do. But for other companies, that might be something that's so impactful in terms of the employees that work for the company that it's not like, if you look at this sort of larger, not just environmental, but also social impacts, it can be very difficult for a company to say, like, we'll get out of this line of business, but we have to lay off 5,000 people to do it. That becomes a little bit of a difficult decision to make from the social side as well. So yeah, but in general, this is a great part of consulting is watching watching clients kind of go through these decision-making processes. So yeah.
That's terrific. What a great overview, I think, for the participants of this, to be able to see kind of all of these different areas and ways that people can have this impact and engage with this as a career. We have a couple of questions. We only have a few minutes left, believe it or not. But we do have some questions that came in, and one that I think you all could kind of really do some news they can use would be a question on what people should be doing during the summers if they wanted to go into this field. You know, are there courses, internships, volunteer opportunities, et cetera? And I bet you all are each positioned within your corner here to kind of have some insight into what are some things that people can do. Just feel free to, does anybody want to go first? I see Sarah Schrodinger. You unmuted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very quickly. Yeah, because this is something actually that we offer at NOAA, and I think actually compared to when I was a student, I think colleges are doing a much better job of connecting students with internships to give them exposure. Like Melanie is an example of that, right? That kind of thing didn't exist in my day, but there are internships out there. I will try to pop in the chat before we close down. NOAA has a student opportunities webpage where that's just related to NOAA related opportunities. But getting that internship in the summer, and more internships are being paid, because we're realizing that not paying is a barrier to that issue of equity that we've been talking about. So more and more of them are. In fact, we just had a policy change at NOAA from our deputy administrator who said, like, we will be paying for internships in the future. So you can't start a new program for interns without paying for them, and we're strongly advising everyone to start paying if they're not already. And many of them are, and they come with scholarships. But yeah, even if you don't end up going into the field from your internship that you experience, knowing what you don't want to do as a result of your internship is valuable. Just as much as figuring out, like, oh no, this is the thing that I have my passion for and I want to do it. So getting as many of those as possible, I highly recommend it. And I will stop talking now and find that link and drop it in the chat, hopefully for everybody to see.
Yeah, I'll pipe in just very briefly. When I was at Stanford, one of my duties was setting up and running an internship program for Stanford students. And yes, allowing them to find out what they didn't want to do with their lives is it's actually incredibly important. So if there's something that is sort of experimental, you think might seem really cool or might not, a 3-month, 2-month summer internship is the perfect way to get your feet wet and sort of at least to be able to watch what it's like to be a professional in that field. In terms of the work I do now, it is really, folks who get hired into my company generally have either a very technical background or a very business-oriented background. So I think essentially, one good thing about consultancy in general is it is it's very amenable to the sort of general liberal arts. You have to know a little bit about everything, but definitely, I'd say any good opportunity in the summer, even if you're not totally sure you want to do it, is definitely worthwhile.
Anyone else have anything to add on that? Melanie?
I'll say this, I think a summer internship opportunity is great. One thing that I would encourage students to think about is, what do you like to do with your time on a daily basis? Because in this field, there is room for everybody. So there's room for people who like to number crunch and work on data. There's room for people who like to do research. There's room for people who are really good at communicating and telling stories. There's room for people who are good at building relationships and doing that glad handling, lobbying, policy work, right? There's room for people who like to educate and teach. There's room for people who like money and finance, right? There are so many different types of roles. And so, like, as a starting point, kind of think about, like, What is it that makes you tick? What do you like to do on a daily basis? It's fine if you already don't know, because an internship can help you, again, find out like, oh, this is the kind of stuff I like to do, or this is the kind of stuff I don't like to do. But if you already have an idea, try to find an internship that actually satisfies that work component, that day-to-day job component.
Those are all great answers. I mean, I think, in an industry where you have a lot of chaos and a lot of things coming up and a lot of things going away, there's a lot of opportunity. That's the other thing I kind of take away from what everybody said today was, you are constantly scouring and looking at and evaluating what the incoming things are and what the outgoing things are, that there's a lot of movement in this area. And so you have to be aware ideologically of what's happening. I think we have one other that we could probably squeeze in under the wire. And that was interesting. It's how does the college go about writing an environment impact analysis sustainability plan and a hiring manager to implement these on both campuses? I don't know if you all can speak directly to St. John's College, but perhaps more generally into how organizations do something like that. Is there anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do this for companies. With the team I work with, but Gigi and I were saying, when we think that actually St. John's has one that is in effect, but maybe has been a little bit under the radar. I'm not entirely sure on that. But yeah, in terms of, one thing I will say is that the key to a sustainability plan that's really robust is to keep going back to it every year and to have a standing committee and make sure that committee reports out publicly and communicates to all the stakeholders about how they're doing on their plan. So if the fact that folks are asking about that means that if a plan exists, it needs to communicate a little better. So.
That's great. Well, speaking of communicating, you all have done such a great, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. I've learned so much from all of you. As somebody who is interested in this field but has zero expertise, I feel like, I was able to take away quite a bit today. And Gigi, I'll pass it over to you and just say thank you so much for getting such an incredible group of experts who all happen to be women. Oddly enough, here we are together to talk about, I think, what is a really incredible emerging field and changing and growing field that that really, St. John's students could connect with.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you, everyone. Big round of applause for this Earth Day panel. And I also wanted to actually do a plug for career development and OPPD, the Office of Personal and Professional Development, because I'm doing that plug not only for the students, but also for any alumni. These kinds of events are a great way for alumni to volunteer their time. And right now, both those offices are building industry cohorts. So essentially cohorts of alumni within certain fields that students are interested in. And this field, environmental and sustainability, is something that students are interested in. So I'm really pleased that we were able to gather everyone together here. I know that I think the first panel that we did for the association back in 2018 was a great panel collaboration with Jamie Dunn from Career Development. And so I'm hoping that we do more of these. And if anyone has further ideas on topics for other discussions, or alumni are interested in volunteering to career development OPPD, for a panel or to kind of volunteer their expertise, please contact the college or the association. With that, I believe there's going to be a ribbon cutting shortly, right after this, on the Santa Fe campus for the solar arrays. And I just wanted to just say one final word. I know that, the Johnnies are all about the contemplative life. But it's really great to see how we've transitioned that contemplative life into life of action. I don't think those are two mutually exclusive positions. And from everything that everyone said on this panel, I think that one definitely feeds on the other. And it's not, an aberration that all the panelists here are persons of action coming from our contemplative background. So again, thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy your Earth Day. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, panelists.